Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. So today on the podcast, I thought I'd delve a little bit further into something that we recently had in our blog, which was using movies in the language classroom. Since then, there's been a little bit of a Twitter conversation about, how to use movies and things like that. So I thought I'd put together some ideas based on how I used to use movies or scenes from movies, and specifically short clips. Typically you'd find these on YouTube or something like that, although you do need to be careful with copyright that you do have permission to use those video clips. So you could definitely use these techniques from DVDs and things like that. And I wanted to give some examples of how I used to teach pronunciation from these movie clips and why they were particularly useful over and above other types of pronunciation activities or authentic text that you could have. So this is going back some years, but I did do some research on this topic because it's something that I really enjoyed doing. I published a paper actually back in 2011 on engagement, perception, and identity, and it is online, so I will publish that in our show notes. And it's all very technical. I was terribly academic back in the day, but basically I will kind of summarize some of the key points here in this podcast for you. So one of the reasons in particular why video input is better than, say, audio alone for teaching pronunciation is this idea of identity. Now, pronunciation in particular is very, very tied up with somebody's identity. I know that from myself. My pronunciation of English, my mother tongue, does change depending on who I'm hanging out with. I grew up and spent my childhood in the States, so if I spend time speaking with Americans, sure enough, my American accent or parts of it come out. Whereas if I'm spending time with my New Zealand friends, my Kiwi accent just takes over. So it's very much, who am I belonging with? Who am I choosing to identify with right now? Just like a different language, you would speak a different language with a different group of people. Accent is the same. It's behavior, and it's choosing which behavior you're going to use. So why is that important for video, you ask? A very good question. Because in a video, you can actually see who it is that's talking like that. If you're about to mimic somebody, because that's what it is, you're mimicking their behavior, their language behavior, then you actually only want to do that if it's somebody that you want to be like. So you wouldn't get, for example, a teenage girl in a classroom learning language trying to mimic a middle-aged man. They won't enjoy it. They don't want to be like that. Why should they copy it? They might do so just out of compliance and being friendly for the teacher and doing what they're told, but it's not going to have the deeper meaning of this is how you be that persona, that French persona that you might be building up. So why is that important? Doesn't everybody speak the same? Well, actually, no, they don't. And this is particularly important in the English-speaking world because there are many different varieties of English. So in another article that I wrote, just trying to find the date of this one, I have it here in front of me, 2012, so a year after the other one, I can't give you links because this one's not online, but it was for the IATEFL Special Interest Group in Pronunciation. I explained in New Zealand, we get a lot of people coming to learn English, or even people who live here, so migrants, people who've moved and they're in an English class because obviously they want to brush up their skills of the people around them, but they don't necessarily want to learn New Zealand English, and fair enough too. New Zealand for them is one place, a small corner of the world. The world for them is much bigger. Certainly it involves their home country, whether that was China or Korea or Egypt or wherever it was. plus the other English-speaking countries that they are familiar with from their previous English learning. So a lot of Korean speakers only have had exposure to American English when they've studied English in Korea. Similarly, some European students who found themselves in New Zealand studying had only had, mostly had exposure to British English in their studies, and so on. It's very varied. So even migrants, but also travellers and shorter term students learning here in New Zealand, they all want to learn a different type of English. It doesn't necessarily equate that they want to learn New Zealand English. So for that reason, I allowed them to choose a video clip, whether it's from a movie, a DVD, or whether something on YouTube, again, watching out for copyright there. I got them to choose a video clip of somebody that they wanted to sound like. And that alone, that choice of saying, hey, you choose a role model for today's lesson, you choose what you're going to sound like, and I'll help you get there. That was, it took some time. Surely you'd be in a language lab and they'd be on the computer or whatever, and they're choosing, but boy, they enjoyed that alone. Oh, I like this BBC accent. Oh, I like the American accent. So we worked with videos from the sitcom Friends, for example, or certainly news clips from the BBC. Very, very sort of proper English in a lot of people's opinion. And some people did choose New Zealand role models. I remember one Chinese woman choosing Kirita Kanawa, who is a famous Maori opera singer originating from New Zealand, but she has a very cultured sort of international accent, and that was a beautiful model to have chosen. And again, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the females would choose female role models and the males would choose male role models. I did not prescribe that, but that's just a natural outcome of what happened. So once a student has chosen a model that they would like to emulate, and if you are choosing that for them, you obviously need to choose a little bit carefully, but the first step in a pronunciation lesson is choosing that model that students can identify with, that learners can identify with, for whatever reason that it might be. And then you've got to select a scene from the movie or from the clip that's quite short. I suggest 1 minute is plenty long enough. You'd probably want to start, the first time you did an exercise like this, start with 20 seconds. That's really long enough because there is so much language that can be had, that can be spoken in 20 seconds. You might even choose 10 seconds, whatever. Be careful of the speed. Native speakers don't realize how fast language often is, and naturally for lower levels you'd want quite a slow speed, and for higher levels you wouldn't necessarily. You might choose to use natural speak between native speakers, something like that. There are technological tricks to slowing down texts. I don't know how to do that directly off YouTube. It may be possible these days, I don't know, but certainly if you had your own MP4 or something, you can find software that can slow it down for you. Certainly with audio you can do that with many software programs, but in any case, just be very careful of the speed. So you've chosen your clip, it's got the correct identity, a short segment that you're going to practice. And the first stage is becoming aware of what the speaker is doing with their pronunciation. So the awareness phase is massive here. So I can only talk about teaching English pronunciation because that's my experience. I haven't had the luxury of teaching pronunciation in other languages, so you'd need to obviously apply language-specific rules here. But in English, for example, some of the biggest things for students to learn about and to notice, become aware of, is word linking. For example, set up. I'm going to set up the table. Set up. We don't say set up, we say set up. So when the first word finishes in a consonant and the second word begins with a vowel, we just say it all as if it's one word. And so the consonant of the first word acts as if it was the beginning of the second word. Now, that may sound like it's a minuscule thing, and native speakers do it all the time. They're not aware of it. They haven't got a clue. It doesn't affect the native speaker interpretation of what people are saying. But for language learners, understanding that words have been phonologically glued together like that makes a massive difference. And I cannot stress this enough. I remember having a student, again, another piece of research that we did a longitudinal study on the effects of pronunciation teaching. She said to me, her own active pronunciation skills hadn't really changed a huge amount after about a year. But what she said to me is, I can hear now. And what she meant was her listening skills, had improved. And she said, most importantly, I can hear when everybody's linking words together. I didn't used to know where one word finished and the other word started, and now I know that. So it's really a big deal for perception as much as anything. So recognizing that a speaker is doing this, if you have a native speaker as a model. Now, I would like to say some of the models that you might choose, particularly in English, may not be a native speaker of English. You may choose an excellent non-native speaker of English, and that's totally fine. And they may not link their words. So it's just as important to recognize that they are not linking as if somebody is linking. So certainly you'd have to lay a foundation of, what is linking. Let's learn to recognize when it is happening and when it's not happening. And I won't get into details here, it's certainly for another podcast, but there's lots of different types of linking, consonant, vowel, 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 consonant, consonant, and so on. So I won't go into that, and the different English accents do a few things slightly differently too. But that is definitely something that you could spend quite a while. So linking is a big feature of English pronunciation that you would certainly pre-teach and practice that awareness with. The other major aspect that makes a big difference for listening skills in particular and active pronunciation skills are weak forms of prepositions. So instead of saying to, you'd say t. Instead of saying for, you'd say f. And again, not all varieties of English will do this. Not all speakers will do this in all contexts. But it happens a lot. And so for students to be listening out for it and to be able to recognize when they're hearing it that it's not a whole new word they haven't learned, it's just a different pronunciation of that word. And they're typically prepositions and conjunctions and those little words like that. So weak forms and linking, I think, are the two biggest aspects of English pronunciation anyway. Which could be, pre-taught and then become aware of. And of course, there's more. So there's certainly pausing and intonation and specific articulations of vowel sounds and that sort of thing. We can cover that on another podcast. But needless to say, my point is after you've chosen your model speaker for identity reasons and you've chosen an appropriate clip, whether it's a DVD segment or a YouTube video, something like that, then you practice awareness. Listen to how the speaker has pronounced this text. It certainly helps if you have a transcript of the text. Now, advanced students could probably just create a transcript pretty quickly as they go along, type out the words themselves, and they might have to listen to it several times to get it right, and they can mark up that transcript. Oh, this is where it was linked, or that was a weak form, and so on. For lower level learners, the teacher might do that beforehand, have pre-written the transcript. So during that awareness phase, you might be underlining any links and circling any weak forms or using a highlighter for this or that or the other thing. So that awareness phase is really important. If you're all working from the same text, that's quite easy because you could mark it all together to make sure that everybody has heard the same thing before you go on to practice it practically and actively. If you are having individual learners with different model texts, obviously that's going to be a little bit harder. I would suggest that they hand in their awareness phase of this project at that stage so that you can correct it if they've heard it wrong before they go on to practice it. So again, you'd have to make a judgment there. So after the students are sure that they've heard it correctly, which words have been linked together, which prepositions have been said with a weak pronunciation and that sort of thing, the next phase comes the actual production part. So again, it's 10 seconds, it's 20 seconds, whatever length you've chosen. Now the student knows what's being said and how it's being said. They can try to actively copy that pronunciation. This can take a long time, even though it's only 10 seconds, 20 seconds. It may take them 20 minutes until they feel confident that they are able to produce the text in the same way or close enough that they're happy with it, with how the model speaker has done that. And that is fantastic. There's nothing better than observing a classroom where everybody's got their headphones on and they're recording themselves and playing it back and having a little laugh or whatever, having another go, reading it, making notes, asking the teacher for help. Did I say this right? Is that how I do it? It's amazing how much motivation there is if they really want to speak like that speaker, hence going back to the identity thing earlier on. So again, that can be quite a long stage of the lesson. They might want to do it for homework. It could be something that they just hand or send, digitally or something like that, a recording of themselves having mimicked the text, the next week or something like that. So it's an assignment. Whatever you choose to do, that production piece is only the end of, a multi-stage process here. But it's very motivating. It's very engaging for students. And that 20 minutes where they're practicing, they would be physically moving their mouths this way, 100 times. It helps to solidify the skills that they've been practicing. And having a time limit, because if you're trying to say at the same time with a native speaker, you've got to keep up with the rhythm. It's a bit like playing in an orchestra. You can play your instrument, but you've got to keep in time with everybody else or it's not going to sound good at all. So the timing, the rhythm, the intonation, everything's got to come together. It's quite a difficult skill. And that playback helps the student to hear whether or not they actually do sound like a native speaker. And for many students, they've never actually compared exactly the same text with the model speaker and their own voice producing that text. So very, very motivating activity. I would suggest also, mimicking and speaking along with the speaker is a good way to start before they just record it alone. So those are the steps to practicing pronunciation with movies, whether it's a DVD or a YouTube clip, as I mentioned. I hope you found that helpful. I loved having lessons like that. I loved the engagement and the energy from the students. So hopefully you can enjoy the same amount of participation. I will post a link to the article that I wrote called Engagement, Perception and Identity. But as I said, I can't post a link to the other one. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and I will see you again soon. Thank you for listening to the Langauge Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.